We have arrived at Dead Space Extraction. Before we discuss the game, it's important to give you some background. EA, the publisher of Dead Space, was seeking to create the next big thing, the next power franchise, and their strategy for this was an idea called IP cubed. It essentially boils down to games with a rich story that can be propagated to other forms of media. So before the first game's release in October 2008, there had already been a comic which ran from the March of 2008 and culminated with the launch of the game. And then, 7 days after Dead Space's release, there was an animated film which went straight to Blu-ray in Dead Space Downfall. Now this approach is something we see quite a lot of today. Just look at what's on Netflix. You got The Witcher series, Cyberpunk, League of Legends Arcane, HBO are putting out a Last of Us series. These days we don't think much of it, but back in 2008, launching a brand new IP with a whole host of supporting media was something that hadn't really been done before. Now this approach didn't quite hit the mark, as even though Dead Space did exceptionally well with critics and the public, it only sold an estimated 1.86 million copies. Not exactly the powerhouse you'd expect with that amount of push. Now EA aren't ones to give up so easily, and so they looked at the marketplace and noticed they hadn't catered for a particular group of gamers, and this group, they surmised, was starving for mature content on their system. I'm of course talking about the Nintendo Wii. Since its launch in November 2006, the Wii had captured the minds and living rooms of new and old gamers, and by the time Extraction went into development, the Wii was already outselling the PS3 and 360, and by the time the game launched on the 24th of September 2009, it has sold nearly twice as much as the closest competitor. The issue Visceral and co-developer Eurocom faced is how to bring Dead Space, a game which graphically cannot run on the Wii, to the system, and provide an experience that was worth playing. The answer was obvious: an on-rail shooter, and as it would happen, they already had a game they could take learnings from which had released in 2007, Resident Evil's The Umbrella Chronicles. And so, Dead Space Extraction came to be, and it bombed hard. The first week's sales amounted to 9,000 units. The only thing that saved it in the eyes of EA was the critical praise the game received, netting a Metacritic of 82%. As for my experience, much like the first game, which if you haven't seen my review you can find it right here, I came to Extraction late, picking it up as part of the limited edition pre-order of Dead Space 2, where it was bundled in, given a HD lick of paint and made compatible with the Move controller. Now I only played it for 3 or so missions before the urge to dive into the second game became too much, and I never went back. So in 2022, I've completed my first ever playthrough of the game, and during the course of this review, I'll explain why this is the best on-rail shooter I've ever played. As always with my reviews, I'll split this into plot, gameplay and presentation, and it's worth saying, there will be light spoilers, but nothing that would ruin the experience for you. Now let's dive in. Taking place just before the events of Dead Space, and culminating in the arrival of Isaac to the Ishimura, the story in Extraction shows us the devastation brought to the mining colony on Aegis 7, following the unearthing of the marker on the planet. Our story is centered around 4 survivors: Nathan McNeil, a colony detective who we play as for the vast majority of the game; Ishimura soldier Gabe Weller, a colony resident Lexine Murdoch, and CEC Executive of Mining Operations, Warren Eckhart. Beginning on the colony, we see firsthand the effects of the marker on the population. Miners are going insane, and there's a full-scale riot happening all around you. People are massacring each other. Ships are crashing down. It's insane. And that's before the necromorphs show up. The group believe that by leaving the colony, they can find safety on board the in-orbit Ishimura. Little do they know, they're leaving one hellhole for another. The locations you visit across the game are exactly the same as Dead Space, outside of a couple of new areas on the planet's surface. But what makes this compelling is seeing how the colony and the Ishimura are in the shape they are by the time Isaac arrives. The actions your survivors try to take to escape the ship are the reason why it's in such a mess by the time the Kellion arrives. It provides a nice bit of context that I never knew I needed. Now, it's not essential by any means, but I appreciate it. The issue with prequels can be you don't have the opportunity to really grow the world outside of what's already explained to have happened. It gives the game the opportunity to show events that were told to us through file pickups in Dead Space, and this works great. However, when it comes to its own audio logs and files, they basically cover off what was in the base game, but in slimmed down formats. For a Wii owner who never had the opportunity to play Dead Space, it does what it needs to convey the story and the wider lore. But for fans of the first game coming back to this, there isn't anything too meaty to gain from the experience. By the time the game wrapped, I knew as much going in as I did coming out of it, with the only exception to this being the subplot involving Lexine and her supposed immunity to the marker. Now this is mentioned quite late into the game, but it isn't really a major focal point. It comes and goes so quickly, I can't even see this as being a spoiler. It's just foreshadowing for a future story that gets told in the Dead Space 2 DLC. The plot, overall, is carried by revisiting key areas from the first game with a likeable cast of characters, and they each play off each other exceptionally well due to their distinct personalities. Eckhart is a corporate scumbag in the same way that Burke was in Aliens, and seeing him opposite the stoic McNeil and the hot-headed Gabe Weller creates interesting character drama as you play through the experience. And in being a prequel, it gives us an opportunity for a cameo from Isaac's girlfriend Nicole. And all I can say is, I can see exactly why Isaac was willing to put himself through so much shit to save her. Ultimately, the plot is there to drive the player from one shootout to another, and give something for new and old fans of the series to take away from the experience. Personally, I would have appreciated some additional lore to make me see the events of Dead Space in a completely new light. But, with the events of the movie and the comic book, they're kinda stuck in having to stick to what's already out there. Extraction is a nice tie-in story, which does exactly what it needs to do. And really, that's all I can ask for in an on-rail shooter. Extraction brings Dead Space to the on-rail genre in a near-perfect transition. So what makes this possible? Well, to put it simply, it knows what a Dead Space game needs to have to root it in that universe, and manages to bring it all over to a new genre. Take weapons. In the base game, every piece of your arsenal has an alt-fire type. In Extraction, it's the same thing. Turn the move controller to the side, and not only do you look gangster, you now have access to the alt-fire. Super simple to do, and in a motion-based game, it feels kinetic without feeling gimmicky. These alt-fire types are taken directly from Dead Space 1. The plasma cutter changes from horizontal to vertical. The force gun throws out force grenades. Now there's a couple of changes, but generally it's incredibly faithful. And as the enemies you face are identical to the base game, it means you can rely on old favourites to get the job done. Now when you enter a stage, you can take 4 guns with you. Now these are found across the environment and can be dropped and refound later with the ammo that you left in them. It gives you a chance to experiment, to try new ones out and not lose any of the ammo reserves and upgrades that you've built up. Ammo isn't a massive deal, just like it wasn't in the base game. You have ample across your entire arsenal, but you can't rely on one single piece to get the job done. You'll need to switch between them fairly regularly to adapt to the challenge presented, and in doing so, you can ensure you don't run too low on one particular weapon. Across the environment, you'll find ammo, guns, and upgrades, and these increase the damage or clip size of the gun itself. It pays to pay attention to your surroundings, as the camera doesn't hang around for too long while you move between encounters. Speaking of the camera, if you've seen my Resident Evil Dark Side Chronicles video, you'll know how detrimental it can be to a gameplay experience. Here in Extraction, it knows it's an on-rail shooter first, and story games second. Your character is constantly on the move, and it's here that story is delivered. But as soon as a necromorph appears, you are given ample opportunity to line up shots, rooting in place to dispose of the undead scum as quickly as possible. Now, I was super worried in the first couple of minutes that this might not be the case, with how quickly the camera seemed to pan between characters while they talked to each other through the environment. But after the first encounter, I knew they'd nailed it. I'm always saying a game needs to remember what it is and stick to it, and that's exactly what Visceral and Eurocom achieved here. When it comes to other hallmarks of the series, you can't forget kinesis, stasis, and zero gravity. All of these return. Kinesis is mainly used to collect the ammo and items across the stage, where stasis is used exclusively for combat. Extraction gives you 3 uses of it, which auto-refill with the passage of time. Using this resource wisely by picking your targets, destroying their legs, and then using stasis to refocus on faster threats can make all the difference in a chaotic battle. On the normal difficulty, Extraction is extremely forgiving, but take it up a few notches, and your judgment in using this resource will be tested. The feeling of letting off a stasis blast and hitting nothing but air is a kick right to the ballsack. On the higher difficulties, you can feel your chances of survival disappear before your eyes. So if you're looking for a challenge and a reason to replay, Extraction will go Whalestone Raider on your ass.
You want some? I'll give it you.
Finally, the game includes puzzles. That's right. A light gun game provides something that most survival horror games can't even do. Now, I'll set your expectation here. You won't be hunting around for 3 separate keys or pondering over your documents. Extraction basically turns into a game of operation. You need to follow the path outlined with your motion controller with a steady hand, while avoiding obstacles that revert your progress. Now, it sounds really basic, and I suppose it is, but it's often used in conjunction with a flood of enemies coming at you. Now, in co-op, which the game provides via drop-in, drop-out, your partner could cover you to
Share the load.
In solo play, you have AI there, but they're as useful as a sexy nun. And so it's just you, stasis, and a steady hand. And the pressure you experience is incredible. The puzzles aren't deep, but it provides a welcome shake-up to the gameplay whenever they appear. Gimmicks like these are hard to pull off and feel satisfying for long periods of play, but Extraction does it so effortlessly. There's so many little things I could gush about here, from the alternate pathways which encourage replayability outside of difficulty, the Ripper's primary fire being controlled by moving the saw forward and back with the motion of the move controller, to the reload having a sweet spot to get you right back into the action quicker. Every facet of its gameplay sings, and it's a far cry from what we had with the Dark Side Chronicles, which put the story it was telling above the gameplay itself. Extraction feels like Umbrella Chronicles, but with more thought, an actual story that's worth telling, and loads of little gameplay features that they couldn't do without motion inputs. I'm honestly blown away by how Extraction plays, and I could go on about it for hours, but I've made my points here, so let's move on to presentation. Extraction originally released on the Wii, and as such, it was limited to a 480p resolution running at 60 FPS. The PS3 version upscales this to 1080p and retains the 60 FPS. Now I'm glad to report that throughout my entire playthrough, I didn't encounter a single bit of slowdown or frame loss. It ran perfectly. In researching the game, I've noticed threads where the Wii version does encounter slowdown while using the flamethrower against large waves of necromorphs, so that may be something worth considering when choosing to revisit this title. One issue this game has on PS3, and it must be substantially worse under lower resolutions, is the lighting. Dead Space ensured each weapon had a torchlight, which appeared when you take aim. Extraction doesn't do this, instead giving you the option to waggle the controller to light a glowworm. Now this provides ample light, however, you can't activate it at any point. It's only on selected sections of maps, and it's not exactly clear when you are able to do it. And so for large portions of the game, I was waggling my worm like a kid who's found his first copy of Playboy. It took me far too long to realise the game will prompt when you're able to use it, and I felt a substantial amount of frustration when I realised I'd been waggling for no reason. Everyone loves a good waggle. Everyone loves a good waggle, but waggle too much and you'll go blind. At least that's what I heard. Speaking of blindness, the lighting is incredibly dark. Now I ended up going into my settings and turning the brightness up several times across the game before finally just going the whole hog and putting it up to max. With the muddiness that comes from sub 720p, I can't imagine how difficult it becomes to see approaching threats. Now there's two other differences between the versions that may help you choose between them. On the Wii, you have access to bonus materials included on the disc, and this is a motion comic. Now for the PS3, this option has been removed, and instead, you'll have to navigate the PS3 PSN store and download them from there. Now if you ever want a horrifying experience, try finding anything on that piece of shit. I swear, it's a form of torture in some POW camps. The final difference is how the game calibrates your motion controller. The Wii has you point at several targets on screen to get accurate calibration, whereas the PS3 gets you to point at the PSI camera. The light blinks a few times, and that's it. It's done. Now for PS3, make sure to put the camera squarely under the TV. If you do that, you'll be fine. But put it anywhere else, and you're asking for issues. It's a small gripe, but one I thought was worth pointing out. Putting the differences aside, Dead Space was a beautiful game both in how it looked and how it sounded. With the environment's character models and sound palette lifted from its older brother, it's no surprise then that Extraction knocks it out of the park on all fronts here. When it comes to performances, outside of one bad audio log found in Chapter 3,
the marker, as the unitologists call it, the Extraction team all went crazy. The brass says it's coincidence, but that's bullshit. Now, half the miners are suffering from some weird dementia, but nobody dares suggest it's because of the artifact. Well, I will, and I don't like where this is going.
No shit.
The main cast truly bring their individual characters to life, and they're excellent. Due to the nature of the game and its quick 6-hour runtime, they don't have the chance to show a huge amount of depth, but what is shown to us is enough to convey the strengths and weaknesses with each character, and you'll soon grow to enjoy each of them for what they bring to the story and to each other. Dead Space Extraction could have been a lazy cash grab title, a game where it recycled everything and added very little, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Extraction successfully brings Dead Space to an on-rail shooter and uses its motion controller features to enhance the experience. The plot may not have been something I needed to experience to understand the world of Dead Space, but it did introduce some intriguing characters which I'm looking forward to rendezvousing with in the Dead Space 2 DLC. Now, if you enjoyed the Resident Evil light gun games in the Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles, you will adore Extraction. It's leagues ahead of those two titles, and for my money, the best on-rail shooter I've ever experienced. Do yourself a favor, dust off the Wii or the PS3, and get ready to waggle that worm. You won't regret it. And that's it for this review. If you enjoyed it, put a like on it, and consider subscribing for more Dead Space reviews. I try to respond to everyone on my channel, so if you've played Extraction or have any questions, reach out and we can discuss it. Up next, I'll be reviewing Dead Space Ignition before I move on to the Resident Evil Village DLC, and I look forward to seeing you back here soon. If you're still looking for a bit more from me, consider checking out my PlayStation podcast, In PS We Trust. It's available right here on YouTube in edited video format, or via Spotify or any podcast service that you use. And that's it for me. Thank you for your time. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other. See ya.